Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and it's your job to draw what you see. We'll have an artist joining us, doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It is entirely up to you. Once the session is finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. You can also download the reference photographs and watch this video again after the session is finished. So if the artist is going too fast for you, don't worry. You can watch the video now and then watch it again later on. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this latest Raw Umber online portrait tutorial. In this single 1-hour pose, I'm going to take you through all the basics of the structure all the way to the finish of this portrait. Now, as you can see, I'll be working on white paper and I'll also be using willow charcoal, maybe later in a drawing some compressed charcoal pencil or a black pencil. To erase, I like to use a grey putty rubber, but you can also use a normal white rubber with a nice sharp edge. Finally, to blend, I like to use a mixture of different blending tools, but the ones I use most are a hog brush, a stiff brush, and a soft acrylic brush. Now, as always, you can find my favorite materials in the material box below the video. And without further ado, let's get started on the portrait. Now, I'm working with willow here, just because it's a little softer and easier to erase. And the first thing I look for is the big box of the head. Now, it's always useful to find a square somewhere, because we can then compare the length versus the width and know these two should be roughly the same. And this is called comparative measurement. In this case, I can see that the chin to the top of the head is roughly the same as the width from each widest part of the hair. And once I've got this big shape, I can just use a willow piece of charcoal, maybe a bit sanded, to open up the grain and just fill this whole area in with charcoal. Now, if this is picking up a bit too much of the grain of the paper, you can use a blending tool or a bit of kitchen roll to just blend this together. And the reason why I do this is I want to start thinking in terms of masses, of tones, rather than lines. And this is something that I will talk about throughout the rest of the video. Now, of course, we do need lines, and one of the biggest reasons to need lines is to sort of start measuring. And the first thing I always look for is the center line. And it's the line that goes all the way from the middle of the forehead down towards the middle of the chin. And when I compare the widths, I can see that that center line sits not quite in the middle of the picture, but instead maybe a bit further to the left, about 1/3 compared to the 2/3 on the side. It's also useful to look at the angle of the center line. In this case, I can see the chin is a bit further in, so there's a slight diagonal there. The next thing I like to look at in terms of lines is the 3/3 of the face. This will be forehead to brow, brow to nose, and nose to bottom of the chin. Now, it's useful to know that these should all be in the same direction. So normally the nostrils are not going off in a completely different direction to the corners of the eyes or the corners of the lips. Instead, they all roughly go in the right direction. And this direction gives us some information about the perspective of the portrait. In her case, I can see there's a slight angle happening on all these parts of the figure. Now it's also worth noting that these free verts aren't perfect. In some people they may be a bit bigger, for instance for the mouth area, smaller for the nose area, but I do find them to be a very good starting point, even if it is just to see where somebody deviates from the norm. Now when taking the whole skull into account, the corners of the eyes will usually sit somewhere in the middle. And again, if we take a line through the outer corners of the eyes, the same angle as we found for the nostrils, the corners of the mouth, the corners of the brows for instance, all should be in the same alignment. Now once I've got this, I can start building up the planes of the face. By this I mean the diamond shape of the face. When we're looking at her portrait, we can see that the forehead, the cheekbones to the chin are all in light, with the widest point being the cheekbones, the forehead being the second widest point and the chin being the most narrow. Now this diamond shape is really important for likeness. In some people there will be more of a heart shape, in other people the chin will be almost as wide as the forehead, so it really says something about the shape of someone's skull. Now we've got this framework in, I'm going to start darkening the areas around this diamond shape. Because like I said at the beginning of the video, it's really useful to start thinking in terms of masses of tone rather than lines. And if I think in masses, and I start just by darkening the area of the eye sockets versus the bottom of the nose, already we'll get an idea of the face with putting relatively little effort into the drawing. So even with these two big shadow planes, We already have quite a lot of information there. We know the shape of the diamond plane of the face. We know where the eye sockets are, where the nose is, how big the forehead is against the cheekbones. So this is really the building block on which we can start to build the portrait. And if I just follow the tip of the nose to the space between the brow, we already have an idea of the placement of the nose, the bridge of the nose, as well as the eye sockets. And very quickly, the idea of a face will start to form, even though we just have some dark shapes and some light shapes there. So these three main shadow shapes or planes are the main areas and the building blocks of the portrait. And straight away we will recognize this pattern as a human face. Ultimately, all we see is dark and light tones, but our brains are designed to immediately recognize this. And this is also incidentally something that you would look to conceal if you'd be doing something like military camouflage. And this is because our brains so naturally see this pattern of three dark blocks and interpret it as a face. So we can use our brain's tendency to find the human face in shapes in our drawings to our own advantage. That's why I like to start using masses first, because they communicate a lot more with a lot less effort. Now, of course, lines are still important, so if you want to, you can also add a few lines just to indicate the outline of our skull. But I try to think of lines as help lines rather than the be-all end-all of portrait drawing. So on top of this, I'm very quickly going to start switching back to mass drawing, adding in areas like the hair before starting to refine the portrait a bit more. Now, when looking at the eye sockets, it's useful to think of the structures. And the first thing, of course, is the round shape of the eyeball, with the corners of the eyes sitting in the middle of that eyeball. And finally, we can then see the brow arching above it, adding that protective arch to the eyeball itself. And because this arch of the brow hangs over the eye, this means that the eye will often be in shadow when the light is coming from the top. Now below the eyeball, we have the expanse of the cheekbone, going towards the sides of the nose. And again, this area sticks out a bit more. Again, to protect that eyeball that's vulnerable in the middle. And because the cheekbones stick out a bit more, they usually will be in light. Now one eye is of course relatively easy, but matching up the eyes is a bit harder. So for this I use an imaginary line going through both sides, making sure I connect up the corners of the eye, which then helps me place the eyeball and the arch of the brow. Now when moving on to the nose, like I said at the beginning of the video, the 3/3 don't always match up perfectly. In this case I can see that her nose to brow is a lot shorter than the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin. So I'm just lifting up the nose a bit before starting to find that structure of the bottom plane of the nose, looking at the width of the nostrils versus the width of the corners of the eyes, and building up this wedge shape of the nose. Now continuing to build up the features, going from the corners of the nose we can see two folds roughly connecting up with the corners of the mouth. So you can think of the mouth area as a round form, and when dividing the bottom of the chin to the bottom of the nose we can see that this round shape takes up about 2/3 of the total length. So the first third is bottom of the nose to bottom of the top lip. Then we've got bottom of the top lip to start of the chin, and then top of the chin to bottom of the chin. And again, using this natural inclination of our brains to find patterns, if I simply darken the top lip and darken a little patch below the bottom lip, straight away the mouth starts to form. And when I've got these basic shapes, I can start moving them around to create her specific mouth shape. And when doing this, it's good to look at how wide the light area of the mouth is, how wide the chin is, how far do the corners of the mouth extend outwards. Do they go to the middle of the eye sockets, for instance, or are they closer to the nostrils? And these are all good questions to ask when you're trying to get a likeness. But ultimately, all we're doing is pushing light and dark shapes around. And feel free to try out a few different shapes there. Make the top lip a bit wider or make it a bit more narrow. Where you can push up the whole lip area and keep trying stuff out until it feels right. Now while I'm doing this, if you have any questions at all about this or any other part of the video, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Right now I'm using a pastel blender, which is just a makeup sponge really, to sort of erase, because I find it a bit softer than using an eraser directly on the paper. And this also has the added advantage of not going all the way back to the white of the paper, which is great because we're working with the toned paper here, toned by the charcoal. Now this does take off quite a bit, so I do use it mostly as an eraser rather than as a blending tool. And there's so many different blending techniques to try, so I always recommend to just buy a whole bunch of them and try them out and see what they do to the drawing and what you prefer to use. For instance, if I want to just flatten or get rid of some texture in the darks, without changing the tone, I would use a rougher, stiffer brush, like for instance this Hawk brush, because the stiffer the brush, the less charcoal it takes off. The softer the blending tool, the more it actually starts functioning like an eraser. I also like to drag the blending tool across my shadow versus my light, and this just softens the edge between the two. Now you can do this carefully, going along all of the edges, and if you're brave enough you can do it over the whole picture. For instance, right now I'm going across all of my edges with my soft pastel blending tool. And you may think that I'm destroying the drawing, but actually I am using it to create a very soft base to then add more shapes on top of. Now this is completely optional and you don't at all need to erase your drawing you've worked so hard on, but sometimes it's really nice to start with a very soft base and then start adding shapes on top. Again, it's completely up to you, and I would advise you to try out both ways and see what works better. So now hopefully we'll be in a place where we've got a rough sort of impression of a face, some eye sockets, bottom of the nose, and some shapes for the lips. At this point I can start breaking this down a bit more. And I always start with the structural points of the features. In this case, the corners of the eyes. And the reason I start with this and not, for instance, the pupil, is that the corners of the eyes will never move. Even if the eye moves and we've got a live model in front of us, they may blink or they may look up or down, but ultimately the corners of the eyes are structural and therefore will stay in the same position. And this also goes more or less for the corners of the nose. Now, of course, these are a little bit more movable, but I find that in daily life, most of the time, they'll stay in the same place. And once I'm happy with these corners of the eyes, I can start looking for the shape of the top lid. And I do this by just adding a darker shape underneath it. Again, the top lid is sticking out, so therefore will catch more light at the top and cast a shadow below it. And this means I can also start finding the highlight in the middle of the top eyelid. Now at this stage, if you find that the willow charcoal is a bit too uncontrolled, feel free to use a compressed charcoal pencil to start really finding your dark and light shapes. And all I'm looking for here is the base of the brow versus the top of the eyelid. The bottom of the top eyelid versus the corner of the eye on the far side, so the outer corner of the eye. And finally the light that hits the cheekbone at the bottom of the lid. Now as you can see, I'm not actually drawing the eye itself. Instead I'm drawing the structures that surround the eye. And the more I draw these structures, the more the eye will start to appear. One thing to note about compressed charcoal is that it doesn't erase very well, so try to use a very soft touch there. And as you can see, when I blend over it, it doesn't really move. So try to only use it when you're more or less getting a bit more confident about where you need to place these dark shapes, and know that you don't need to erase back into them anymore. Now if you're happy with the placement, feel free to just darken these tones a bit more to really show the difference between the shadow shapes versus the light shapes of the structure in the eye. Same thing with the other eye, looking at the corners of the eye, the shape of the top lid, and then the dark shape underneath that top lid. That's both the eyeball and the bottom lid together. With the mouth, I tend to again build up the tones, make them a bit darker, but try to make the corners of the mouth the darkest part. Because ultimately, just like the eyes, the mouth turns away with the rest of the skull, which means that the corners will be darkest, whereas the middle of the mouth will be just a touch lighter. Now, as the face is starting to form using these big masses of light and shade, it can be very tempting to get stuck here and keep refining the corners of the mouth, the eyes, the eye sockets, and so on, most of all the features. But actually it's the shape of the head that really helps create that sense of likeness. So once I'm more or less happy with the placement and the shape of my features, and I start to see a face in there, I then want to start switching my attention to the rest of the skull. I'm just trying to explore here using tone, where the cheekbones are, versus the forehead, the roundness of the cheekbones versus the forehead, and the way the forehead turns into the hair. Now it's sometimes helpful to do this a few times. Add some charcoal on, blend it back in if you're not entirely happy with it, and try again. The really nice thing about this way of working is that you have lots of ways to keep trying, keep applying, and redo, while also at the same time building up the tones of the portrait. And working this way is a really good precursor to painting as well, because this is ultimately how oil painting works. It's just stains of dark and light shapes and colors that we then push around on the canvas to create that likeness. Lines don't really come into it when you're painting. Now the temptation may be to, for instance, start using lines to indicate something like the neck. But instead what I can do is start lightening the background behind the neck to create that sense of line without using an actual line. So instead I'm just using the tones there. And I can do the same thing with the texture of the hair. Rather than drawing this out using line, I can just drag my rubber across, looking at transition from the dark shapes into the background. And when I get those shapes right, the hair will start to form automatically. So again, just using tones to create an illusion of depth. And this is something that the Impressionists used a lot. And around the time that the camera came, artists started realizing that all we really see is stains of tones on our retina. We don't really see what we think we see. And the Impressionists used this to great success by starting to just add dots as well as streaks on the canvas and still creating an amazing image. It's useful at this stage to start looking at the transition from the tones into each other. For instance, when I look at the outline of her head, I can see it's very, very sharp. There's a clear transition from the light into the back of the head and the hair. So I can just use a line here to indicate that. On the other hand, if there's two tones that are pretty dark next to each other, for instance here the hair versus the bottom of the chin, I can just let these two tones completely let themselves disappear into each other. And this is another illusion that we don't even notice this when we're looking at the final piece. And this is again because our brains can connect these patterns and just extrapolate from the lines that we do put down. So for instance with the neck here, I do use a little line, a sharp transition to indicate the start of the neck. But then I let the hair and the chin and the neck all start to fade into each other where I don't see a sharp line. The same thing with the nose. I can see some parts of the shadow are really sharp. Other parts are a bit softer. So I'm just using my blending tool, allowing it to go over the edges of these shadows to create this soft transition. And the more variety I can add to the transition from the dark tones into the light tones, the more realistic the portrait will start to feel. And finally, I can add some highlights to the tip of the nose to bring out the nose a bit more. Now again, if you're not entirely in the right place straight away, feel free to blend this in again and then try again, slowly building up those tones. Now I tend to think of line as a bit of a superpower, in the sense that it really pulls the eye in. And what I mean by that is that you want to use it sparingly. The more you use lines everywhere, the more focus you pull everywhere. So if we only use a few lines, that will bring the focus to the few places that we do want it. So for instance, with the lips here, I try to lose as much as I can, only pulling out a few sharp lines around the corners of the mouth and the start of the chin. The same thing with the chin into the hair. The instinct may be to put a line there, of course, as they're both two separate things. But instead I try to put only a little line down, just hinting at that transition, and then letting the rest just float into each other. So right now I've got a line hinting at the chin and a line hinting at the cheekbone, and I've dissolved the two other tones completely into each other. But I find that I don't miss it, because actually this lack of line pulls the eye towards the features rather than the areas that I don't want the viewer to look. So using lines sparingly is also a nice way to find focus in a drawing and decide where you want the viewer to look, rather than have the viewer look everywhere at once. And this brings me to the last part of the video, and that is pulling focus. Now in my case, I want the viewer to look at the eyes, so I'm going to start adding smaller shapes to the eyes and more lines to bring focus to that area, whereas I, for instance, can keep the hair very loose and very soft to pull focus away from that area and bring the viewer to look at the eyes. Now again, I'm using line very sparingly. For instance, if I want to indicate the irises, I try to just use a slightly darker tone there to indicate where she's looking. And for the bottom of the eyelid, I just use a smaller little light shape. So I'm not adding detail in the traditional sense of the word. Instead, I'm just adding my light and dark tones, but I'm making the shape smaller and smaller. Don't forget, the more you lose your shapes, the more focus there will be on the shapes that you do have found. So for instance, with the side of the left eye here, I let it blend into the hair and the side of the face, and hopefully this will make sure that the areas that are found will pop out even more. So I'm just going to continue finding these lost versus found shapes until we're at the end of the pose, and I might even speed up the video just to show you the end of the process there. And in the meantime, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Otherwise, I will speak to you at the end of the video. Alright, so that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you've enjoyed drawing this portrait. Now, if you'd like to show us your work, use the photograph button right here in the chat, or alternatively, you can use the hashtag #RawUmberLive. Finally, if you've enjoyed this video and you're considering subscribing, we really appreciate your support. There are 2 videos a week. On Wednesdays it's a figure pose, and on Sunday afternoon we do portrait. In addition to that, we do have many guest artists who also do painting tutorials, so do check it out if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you at the next video.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.